Poetry slam downtown. Main library.
Thank you. How is everyone?
Great.
Good. Okay, how many of you have read the book? That's okay. That's why I'll give you a very brief overview of some of my favorite parts. I know it's a little selfish, but I love this book. So we'll get into it. So this third September meetup is our first one. Woo-hoo. So I do want to say thank you to Ashley and Jones for bringing this together. I want to say thank you to Jordan, who I've been working with, and Shannon, and then also to America. So let's get into it. Also Imani Perry for writing this beautiful book. So the book is called South to America, Journey Below the Mason-Dixon to understand the soul of the nation. Imani is a Birmingham-native, and really in this book, she talks about how the history of the South is really like a dance. There are always multiple moving parts. And so we started our book club with the first few chapters here. So we have an errand into the wilderness, Appalachia. Who knows much about Appalachia? No one? I love Appalachia, low-key, even though it's like probably problematic in some ways. Then we have More Than a Memorial with Birmingham and Magnolia Grace and East Lilies for New York. So the first chapter, An Errand into the Wilderness, it really enters with this conversation about Harper's Ferry, which for some people see it as a Confederate win, but really it was kind of the start of seeing the foundation of Black organization from the way I read it. So with this, we have Shilton Green, who was a Black man, John Brown, who was an abolitionist. And long story short, they kidnapped George Washington's nephew, and as you can imagine, that didn't end very well. So they were killed. But in the process of that, there was a school that was founded called Stewart College in honor of John Brown. And that location actually happens to be a site where a lot of Black people were educated and a lot of Black activism took place. People were able to gather and to organize. So that's a little bit about that. Another thing about Appalachia, we talk a lot about like slavery, but not really about the shame and the legacy of slavery. So that's kind of what we discussed a little bit in our first meetup, but one of the parts of the book that I think illustrated that really well was a story about a slave who dropped a glass picture. So after he dropped the glass picture, what happened was he was dismembered and they tried to bury his body, and all these natural disasters began to happen, and the bones and they just kept being unearthed, like they couldn't bury this shame. So we see a lot of that within Imani's book, is that she really wants, this to me is just a memory of Black history and also white history as well. So another thing about Appalachia, who has worked in coal mines and knows someone who worked in coal mines? No, no one here? Okay, that's fine. I come from people who coal mine. So an interesting thing about that is that Appalachia is a huge site for coal mining, including Alabama. A lot of the things that we don't discuss is how segregation also impacted coal mining. So sometimes what would happen is that when segregation was taking place and all these miners who moved from the south up north and moved down, they began to develop lung disease. And so since there was no place to bury them, they would be buried on the side of the road or wherever they passed away, which is very tragic. And I know that's something in our history that we discuss. And then also something within Appalachia that she discusses is the crimes are created. So there's like this herb in Appalachia, I think it's like, is it ginkgo?
Ginseng.
Ginseng, thank you so much. It was ginseng. And so it's a very rare, powerful herb. And long story short, they criminalized it for the people within Appalachia. So these are injustices and histories that she talks about that's really varied, and it really kind of plays into class as well. So the next chapter that we are discussing today is More Than a Memorial, Birmingham. And I love Birmingham, that's where I'm from, and she talks a lot about, I love the imagery of the plastic couch. Like, people who know their grandparents who had a couch that they would keep covered in plastic to preserve it, she uses that as the South, specifically Birmingham, really kind of preserves our culture and our family in that way. So a lot of the things she talks about is labor. A lot of the times when we think about Black people moving from different areas and migrating to the South, specifically Alabama, there weren't a lot of opportunities for labor. So a lot of them were domestic workers, working in mines and things like that. And then she also discusses even people who worked in like academia would come to Alabama, specifically Miles College, and get this, ask what their salary was and laugh like it was a joke, but in actuality it was not a joke. They were still getting paid lesser than their actual work. So along with health, Imani talks about her own health issues and how the iron industry really polluted the environment in Alabama and how there were opportunities for us to rectify that, but they were denied because they didn't want to get this image of being just an unsafe place to live. So another thing that she talks about is including the full scope of whiteness within our history. So like, we talk a lot about Bull Connor, but we don't also talk about the people who are also rallying with and partnering with Black Americans in our fight for equality. And then the third chapter that we'll be discussing today is Magnolia's Graves and Easter Lilies with New Orleans. And for me, what stood out the most in this chapter was colorism. And so she talks a lot about how her mother spent some time, she was a novice, so she spent some time with these nuns. And this organization is, I think, the second in the United States that accepted Black nuns. And so this place was really a center for refuge for Black nuns and Black people. So what they did in this organization is that they taught free and unfree Black people how to read. They took care of them, the elderly as well. But then, I guess to balance it out so it doesn't look quite like a safe haven for some people, there's also this balance of there were plaquage, that's French, I don't speak French, so so basically what that is that what would happen is very light-skinned, fair-skinned women would basically be mistresses to wealthy white men. They would have, they would benefit financially, they would be taken care of, but at the same time, it was just kind of like outside of slavery, basically being a mistress. I don't know how to say it, I don't want to be too explicit. And then along with mass incarceration, so people think that mass incarceration is like this new thing that happened within like the last like maybe 70 years, but it's not. It really, Imani talks about how it really started within New Orleans. And I think the percentage is like 66% of the Black population in New Orleans is incarcerated. And then she goes on to talk about the impact of Hurricane Katrina and how all these histories, both beautiful and ugly, were not able to be preserved because of the storm that took place. So with that, I would like to welcome my co-teaching assistant, Jordan, and then our panelists. Yes, ma'am. Come to the stage. She's going to the stage, and then Leathers and Carrie, will you guys come up to the stage as well? Let's give them a round of applause. I'll give you guys the opportunity to just tell us who you are and your name.
So I'm the other teaching artist for Birmingham Reads. My name is Jordan Wright. I have a background in anthropology and African American studies, and I'm currently getting my master's in Africana studies. So I am really at home here. I've come up with some great questions for our panelists that I believe will be thought-provoking for all of us.
Okay. My name is Vicarious Blevins. My background is in communications and in Arcana studies.
I apologize. Give me a sec and I will bring up your presentation.
Okay. And during that time, as far as working in communications, I had the opportunity to do some archival work for Glen Hilly and Birmingham Housing Authority. And during that time period, I came across a lot of records that had to do with, Birmingham's, history of segregation, history of, redlining, and basically gentrifying and creating these class disparities between, the Black community and, various, white communities within the city. In particular, Hoover and how Hoover itself was created in order to, distance themselves from people they thought were undesirable, such as Black people at the time, Italian people, Jewish people, things of that nature. So I'm hopefully here I can represent as someone who has been in organizing spaces, has some, degree of experience with advocacy, and maybe kind of shed some light on how that history not only affected Birmingham, but also my own personal history as a resident here.
Hey y'all, my name is Kerry Fountain. I'm a local artist, a programmer. I do different arts programming in Birmingham. My day job is at the Birmingham Museum of Art, where I'm the manager of public programs. So I'm all about just curiosity and trying to bring people together to encourage dialogue and conversation. And I guess most reflective of this panel tonight is probably Black Cherry Tree Project, which is a project that I co-founded, which works to commemorate the 33 documented lynching victims in Jefferson County by working with local artists and Jefferson County Memorial Project to dive into the research of each respective victim and create works of art. And then also plant black cherry trees across Birmingham in honor of each victim as a way to create transgenerational dialogue. And Blevins is actually one of the artists in the first cohort. So it's a project that is deeply rooted in community and continuing the dialogue and conversation to really begin to consider racial reconciliation and the possibilities of that and how we can begin to think about that as a community.
Okay, so to start off first, I would like to take a moment of silence. Today is September 15th. It is the 59th anniversary of the 16th Street church bombing that occurred on Sunday, September 15th, 1963. So I would just like to take a brief moment of silence. All right. So our theme for today is Who Bears the Legacy of Slavery? And if you see me looking down, I'm looking at the questions that you all will see up here. Because I can memorize, but I am very long-winded in my questions, so I can't memorize that much. So this is going to be like a conversation between our two panelists, and after the end of our panel discussion, we will open it up to you all. So if you all have any questions for myself or the panelists, feel free to ask them at that time. So just to start off, I want us to kind of conceptualize slavery in terms of America and how it differed from other forms of slavery throughout history. So either one can start.
I'm not, completely enlightened about the specifics of slavery across the globe, but what I guess read a little bit about was just the cruelty of slavery in the South compared to some Latin American countries. It was, given the fact that like Latin America was not only Catholic, there was at least some consideration for slaves to seek, treatment for specific ailments or the right to be fed.
Sorry.
But overall, I think there's definitely a difference within the cultural understanding and acceptance of enslaved Black Americans and the way that was kind of viewed and perceived within the Black community. I think there's definitely a difference.
To add to your point, Carrie, slavery in particular, and American slavery in the Western Hemisphere, is always kind of like specified as American chattel slavery, right? And what makes, in my opinion, American chattel slavery in particular so heinous is that it was systemic in nature. It was a way of kind of like codifying people who enslaved people of African descent, as subhuman. And based off my prior research and my own experience, from what I understand, of course, slavery has always existed throughout human history in different various forms. But oftentimes, people are either able to, by the way out of slavery, they might, their children were not necessarily, offspring or children may not have been considered slaves. Sometimes they had some degrees of status within, their particular households, communities, depending on what culture and what people enslaved. Even in Africa, people of African descent had encounters with people of Arab communities and of other, kingdoms and or what people might call, different nations. Like, most of those nations, have been carved up and they don't exist in the way they didn't exist then, the way they exist now. But slavery was not new to us. Different people enslaved each other. But when European colonizers came into Africa, they were buying slaves and participating in that slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade in particular. They were bringing people in boats, and of course it spread throughout the Caribbean, Latin America. And they all had their own various class systems and hierarchies that were used to kind of like oppress people and keep them down. But American chattel slavery in particular was heinous. They took people, and not only did they make them slaves, like you're not just slaves, you're property, you're chattel, you are the equivalent of, my cows, my sheep, my horses. Like, you are not a human to me. You are 3/5 of a human. You do not deserve any rights. And not only are you enslaved, your children's children are enslaved. They have no rights. You are beneath me. And even the white people who were there are people who are lower class, or maybe people of Irish descent, or various white communities that may not have been considered Anglo-Saxon, Protestants at the time. They were able to reinforce and participate in that hierarchy of oppression by under the banner of of whiteness. You might be lower class, you might be white, you might be people may consider white trash, but at least you are not like these Negroes, and that reinforces that. And as more people over time, as American history, developed, as more and more immigrants and more people came in, they were able to create these class dynamics that, although you may not have all the privileges of whiteness or of, being a Protestant or what have you, at least you are not black, at least you are not at the bottom. And we see that even today where, people, Black lives, people of African descent, in particular people who are, descendants of enslaved people, enslaved Black Americans, they, are still being treated as second-class citizens to some extent, or they're still, experiencing the trauma and the generational trauma in particular of having endured slavery.
So I think you both answered that question beautifully. I like to always start a discussion by conceptualizing, defining what we're talking about, because especially with slavery, we've all heard the phrase, well, Africans had slaves before Europeans. So I feel like it's important for us to explore, yes, they did have slaves. The sub-Saharan slave trade did exist before the transatlantic slave trade, but not on the mass scale that the transatlantic slave trade existed on, because within 50 years, it surpassed the number of enslaved people being carted from Africa to Europe, to the Americas, and so on and so forth. So it completely surpassed the sub-Saharan slave trade within 50 years. And like you said, it was more brutal than forms of slavery that existed before. And part of this was because of the Renaissance, there was a reclamation of Greco-Roman art and architecture, but also Greco-Roman literature and philosophy. Aristotle was the first that we relate to the racial hierarchy. And Romans also had forms of plantations that the Portuguese began to experiment with before chattel slavery moved to the New World. So both of you answered that very beautifully. So we're going to move on to starting to discuss the chapters. I wanted to start with the chapter on Birmingham, so we're a little bit out of order just because we are in Birmingham, and again, today being the anniversary of the 16th Street church bombing. So the chapter on Birmingham is titled More Than a Memorial, which is especially powerful when we remember that today is the 59th anniversary of the 16th Street Baptist church bombing, in which Denise McNair, Addie Mae Collins, Cynthia Wesley, and Carol Robertson were killed, and Sarah Collins Rudolph was injured. In this chapter, Perry begins by exploring how industrial cities in the South played a major role for Black settlers after the Civil War, similar to cities in the North. Let's first start by exploring how and why cities like Birmingham transitioned from beacons of hope for their Black citizens.
Okay, Birmingham in particular, I don't even know where to begin because I have so much to say. Oh, excuse me. Yeah, I don't even really know where to begin with Birmingham, so I guess I'm allowed to speak to my personal experience. Okay, so my family in particular, the Blenders family, my granddad's side in particular, they grew up in Selma. They were from Selma, Alabama, and they were sharecroppers. So my granddad was a descendant of sharecroppers. You know, I have vivid memories of we went to the colonial village, like the colonial villages that they have here, which is kind of dark-sided in hindsight. They think it's a colonial village, looking at how white folks were they're doing back then, and kind of whitewashing like how they treated Black folks at the time, but whatever. But I remember him showing me it's kind of like this kind of cot, and that's where they used to put babies in. And I remember him, being there like 7 years old. He showing me that, said, I was born in one of those, and it was like a room. It was in a room with dirt floors, and it's just this one little crater there, and that's where my granddad was born in. Grew up poor, underprivileged, uneducated. Eventually, his family they were able to get enough resources to move to Birmingham. He came here, he was still underserved. Eventually, as they grew together, he went from going to Hoover City schools, growing up, in East Birmingham, and moving to what used to be called the airport. The airport community, for those who don't know, used to be the entire community, entire neighborhood, and a primarily Black neighborhood, from my understanding. Even today, you have people from Living Missionary Baptist Church who are basically the descendants of the people that, existed in that particular area. Well, eventually, when the airport was built, they tore that down and people had to move out. And they were spread out, scattered throughout the city. And my folks in particular moved into the Woodlawn, Kingston area in that community, and into various parts of North Birmingham and East Birmingham. And based on my understanding and my research from reading at Lynn Henley Library and researching for the Housing Authority, those communities in particular were, they used to be white. They were slums at one point, white slums, and they were places for white factory workers and people who came from different parts of Alabama to work in live in the city. They were places for them to exist while they worked at the factories. And these places would eventually, through the efforts of the Housing Authority 50 years ago, be transformed into what we call project communities, now project houses. And of course, as those people got gained access to wealth and privilege, or they moved out and Black folks moved in, they moved to onto the outskirts or into Hoover, let's say, other parts of the community, and Black people moved in. And as they moved in, as they moved out, more businesses, more infrastructure went with them, and so you had these people basically existing in ghettos, so to speak, and not reaping the benefits and privileges of that were once there when their white counterparts existed in these communities. So that was my experience. I grew up there, 90s baby. Post crack era when crack hit Birmingham, and basically destroy, parts of my community and everything. That was my experience. Of course, there is a lack of education. Sometimes there's like, a lack of resources in, various communities here in Birmingham. Many of them are underserved. That is a product of, redlining. That is a product of gerrymandering. That is a product of, a class disparity that existed because, the people at the time, the city leaders at the time, like 50 years ago, were creating systems and structures to segregate Black people and their white counterparts from each other, to isolate the resources, from these Black communities, and in many ways disseminate them to the white counterparts who didn't even live anywhere near these areas. And I'm summarizing here, but even the Black communities that existed in Birmingham that had access to some degree of wealth and privilege at the time, even they experienced issues with housing, issues with gentrification, issues of being with their houses being bombed, their communities being intimidated by the Ku Klux Klan and by various white people who did not want them to be there, wanted them to know that they were underneath their heel. And I have grandparents who were alive at the time. They were young adults, if not teenagers at the time, and they were alive to see how segregation, how Jim Crow, how these systems of oppression worked in Birmingham, and how they in many ways kept us from living in the fullness of and thriving as Black Americans living in this country. But that's been my experience, and just my legacy, based off my history and how what my grandparents passed on to me and what I've been taught.
I think.
Yeah, I may not have made that one work. Sorry.
Well, I think you touched when you mentioned like how resources were I can't think of the word, but I guess like when resources were kind of pigeonholed and were not available as much to the Black community. I mean, stemming from segregation through like Jim Crow that happened right after slavery and Reconstruction, and ultimately I think just going back to the question of why Birmingham lost itself as a beacon of hope. I mean, you mix all of that combined with a culture of fear and ingrained like a permittance to like an acceptance of white supremacy being just blatantly represented in every aspect of culture within, I guess, Birmingham. I mean, it's just a natural reaction for it to not be seen as a beacon of hope. And I mean, I think, like fast forward to present day, I mean, when we look at something like lynching and the public, how lynching was, part of lynching was the fact that it was publicly shown. That became a way to kind of instill that fear continually. And then you fast forward to like George Floyd and when we turn on the news in New York, you see an image of another a Black person getting gunned down by police, and continually seeing that's the same kind of concept to keep this structurization of white supremacy ingrained within the mindset that has deeper systematic faults within the overall culture of America. I mean, just the world we live in, and Birmingham kind of being the hub of that that movement. You know, it's also partly, I guess I think about it like, you know, you have to attack the nucleus sometimes in order for it to like reverberate. And, you know, I think Birmingham losing its sight as a beacon of hope for its Black citizens was just a prime example of what was happening already just across, I mean, the world in so many different ways. But you know, and you touching on some of the like history behind it and the specifics of that, you know, it just kind of reiterates that this city is really special in terms of being able to create that national awareness that it did. So,
Awesome. I like the idea of Birmingham being a beacon of hope as far as being, you know, a place for, you know, Black people, and, you know, a place, you know, that has a legacy of civil rights and of freedom fighters and of activists and advocates, you know, working in solidarity to, you know, create some form of systemic change. But currently, and this may be my just subjective opinion, but I feel like many times we, you know, we think that we have moved past, you know, civil rights and everything. Okay, that happened in the past. You know, we've come so far. You know, Birmingham, you know, is on its way, you know, to the top. Birmingham is on its way to, you know, rectify many of the issues and concerns that occurred, you know, 50, 60, some odd decades ago. But even today, you know, there are still, you know, class disparities. There are still, you know, silos and forms of systemic oppression that exist in the city, even as we, you know, do have more Black leadership, more Black mayors, you know, even as we, grow and develop as a city. You know, there were, you know, I'm proud of the change that occurred. I'm proud of the fact that, you know, we have, you know, more access to resources, or that, you know, there are people working diligently to make sure that, you know, people get what they need within the community, whether they be organizers or people who are working our current administration. But we still exist in Alabama. We still, you know, as somebody has phrased to me, you know, a blue dot in a red sea, so to speak. We are still experiencing traumas and issues that on the surface, they may seem like, you know, okay, these are intercommunal conflicts. These are, you know, just, you know, the fault of Black people. You know, they just need to pull themselves up from their bootstraps. They just need to, you know, work harder, be more diligent. But many of the issues, you know, will not be rectified because they are, you know, class issues as well as racial issues. You know, capitalism, these different systems that have in many ways disenfranchised Black communities, you know, not only within Birmingham but across the country, if not the globe. These things are perpetuating this cycle that continues to keep many of us underserved. You know, my experience, you know, here, you know, as far as my education here, you know, with the Ramsey High School and everything, and I think there was a certain degree of privilege of me being able to have access and go to that particular school because I was in an environment with predominantly young Black people who, you know, were knowledgeable of our city and our history, and I was around teachers and mentors who were able to instill in me, the values of my culture and of, you know, having a sense of pride of being here, being in the city and all of that. But I wasn't always seeing that when I went back home. And I was wondering, okay, how is it that, you know, we have this legacy and this history, but you know, my neighbors, my people, we still kind of in, you know, in the trenches, kind of suffering a little bit. You know, we're still experiencing these issues. And going to the library, going to Lynn Haley, having access to those archives, talking with our mentors, you know, even, you know, going to UAB and actually taking and having access to resources that were provided, you know, on my college campus, that really opened my eyes and made me realize a lot of issues here, they're not pathological in nature, they're not, you know, intrinsic, you know, of our own failures as, you know, Black people existing. They're failures that are caused by a lack of resources. They're failures that are a product of, you know, us not having, you know, some form of reparation, some form of, you know, universal basic income. If we don't have, you know, healthcare, we don't have, you know, the access to the resources that would take communities that have historically in the city, you know, been disenfranchised and, you know, brought up to a more equitable and more, you know, and a better quality of life. And how does that tie back to slavery? Bringing it back to slavery, so much of, you know, of the issues here, even in regards to policing, living in a neighborhood that was over police coming up, a neighborhood that, you know, in itself was the catalyst for much of the change here in Birmingham. You know, being that, you know, one of my neighbors, or I wasn't alive at the time, but my grandparents' neighbors, Benita Carter, rest in peace to her. You know, she was killed right down the street from where, you know, I grew up. And that in itself, the policing of, you know, certain citizens and black, you know, neighbors in that community being a product of, you know, the police historically being a tool of white supremacy, of them being a tool of enforcing and, you know, oppressing, you know, Black and brown communities across the country. You know, them being, you know, the product of, you know, slave catchers and patrolmen who, you know, although they claim to protect and serve, you know, the community, to protect and serve the citizens of this country. We know for a fact that they only protect and serve capital. They only protect and serve property. And even right now, myself being, you know, in this library, you know, just some two years ago, we had members of our community marching in solidarity across the street because a young Black man was killed in Hoover. And, you know, justice has still been, you know, found for that particular situation, particular case. And, you know, still been held accountable. The man who killed has still not been held accountable. The police department has still not been held accountable. And, you know, I've, you know, marched up down these streets in this city that has historically been made to keep people that look like me and come from where I come from out of it. And, you know, now I'm here in this library within this same city, talking to people, some who look like me, some who don't look like me, about why, you know, this all kind of feeds off itself. You know, so as much as we are advancing as a city and as a municipality and everything, I think it's important to not allow Birmingham's history to be whitewashed. You know, to believe that, okay, we've already arrived. There's nothing more we can do. We still have a lot of work to do. We still have a lot of organizing to do. We still have a lot of solidarity to build, not only amongst, you know, our Black communities, but amongst, you know, the white communities here and the other diverse Hispanic community, the other groups here who, in their own ways, are experiencing some form of disenfranchisement just due to the political landscape of this country, and Alabama in particular, you know, being that it's a state that is, you know, in many ways contributing to many marginalized groups' rights being, you know, taken away from them currently. Go ahead.
So I moved to Birmingham about 7 years ago, and you know, just I guess coming from like not being a native here, born here, my family's from, my dad's side of the family's from Alabama, but they're from Monroeville, Tom Springs, Southern Alabama, outside of Pensacola. But one thing I noticed quickly, like when coming to Birmingham, is that Birmingham has a story, and its story contributes so much to its aesthetic, and in a very unique way that I haven't really experienced or seen in any other city. And just in talking to, meeting people here, I think it's also interesting that in people's individual identities as citizens from Birmingham are threaded within that, they intersect within that story of Birmingham. And, I think there's a lot of work that has to be done within defining that story for now. I mean, but still also how we define it for now being taught and guided from its past. And so, that's just, I just wanted to add that in, just, coming from, just to kind of like outline my perspective as somebody, coming into Birmingham, and just what kind of like made me fall in love with this place, because it's such a unique composition here. And there's just so much, there's just a very colorful, distinct identity. And I think defining that is like how we're going to continue to be a beacon of hope in the future.
So I think both of you made very great points, and we kind of got us to a good transitional point to our next question. So we're here until 8:30. I think we could go longer. I think probably. I know the library closes at 9. So just in case, I'm gonna try to quickly get us through Appalachia. So both of you got us to a good transitional point, because with the story, I've always heard there's two sides to a story. And with the chapter on Appalachia, as well as the chapter on Birmingham, she returns to the white side of the story. With Appalachia, this first chapter, she recounts her time traveling through Appalachia, and she starts through Harper's Ferry, West Virginia. And she ends up holding a conversation with a Confederate war reenactor. She calls him Confederate Bob. And her thought process on talking to a Confederate soldier is very similar to mine when it comes to, like, if I were to talk to a Confederate soldier or a Klans member, what would that be like? Terrible, in my mind. But when Perry ended up talking to Confederate Bob, it didn't go the way that she thought it would. It did not align with the reality of the conversation that she had. And she spends the rest of the chapter, what I believe, was her struggling to come to terms with the humanity of the Confederacy. Because whenever we talk about the Confederate War, whenever we talk about Klans members, they're not just people. They're like these big, bad, larger than life kind of people. They're persisting. And I see her in this chapter kind of struggling with the humanity of it, and she pairs it with these accounts of Black people being brutalized in Appalachia. So with this, along with her idea in Birmingham, relating it back to the plight of white Southerners who weren't these bad people, who were struggling right along with Black people in Birmingham. I just want to talk about, like, is it important? Do you all feel like it is important to include this plight of white Southerners? And how do we talk about that? How do we encompass that whole story?
How do we include the stories of, underserved white communities in Birmingham story in particular? Well, much of that, as I stated previously, has to do with class and potentially class solidarity, which, in many ways is difficult because of racism, because of colorism, because of these various intersections that we all experience based on our identity. and where we, you know, show up in the world at any given time. I guess I could just, if I could briefly just bring up a personal story. I remember, you know, maybe some 7-8 years ago, as I was, you know, coming of age and kind of growing into myself. I'm still kind of doing that, honestly. But I had a conversation with Sharif Simmons, a poet here. You know, shout out to him. I was friends with his son, and you know, we would, you know, do art and hang out and kick it every now and then, talk about poetry. And I was really angry at, you know, the state of, you know, our country and what was going on at the time. You know, this is post Trayvon, post Michael Brown, right? So I had a lot to be mad about. And I was also a student at UAB, and I was kind of experiencing various forms of, like, you know, just this kind of subtle racism, like microaggressions from different members of the student body at the time. It just, I felt like although the campus and the community was kind of pushing for a sense of diversity and inclusion, I didn't always experience that or feel that on campus. And that caused me to kind of have a bit of a chip on my shoulder at the time. And so I had very little patience for white people at the time. You know, and I got tired of having to, in many ways, defend my existence or defend, you know, why, based on my personal experiences, why these issues matter to people who, you know, young people, mind you, who could not care less, it felt like. Although I always had something to say back, you know. And Sharif said something to me, he was like, you know, as you get older, you'll see that the world is a lot less black and white, a lot more human. And at the time I was like, Sharif, what are you talking about? Like, you know, what does that mean? You know, but I was young and I was angry, you know, I was hot. Because, you know, I was still understanding what, you know, that meant to me, you know, what blackness meant to me, what, you know, systemic oppression looked like. You know, I was experiencing the culture shocks of, like, you know, this reality that I grew up with, living in my neighborhood, living in my community. You know, I was under the impression that we, you know, this is what it's like. You know, okay, we living good. Like, coming to another experience, I'm like, I realized how much I was lacking, how much I did not have, how much, you know, I did not have access to that many of my peers did not have at the time. And that was disheartening to me. But over time, you know, through conversation and through study and through talking to people, sometimes even talking to people who did not share the same political viewpoints that I did, I was able to kind of get an understanding of, like, why they arrived at the mindset they arrived in, how in many ways, you know, our white counterparts, the white community, they in many ways have been misled, misguided, you know, through, under the banner of white supremacy, how white supremacy has not only did it strip us of our ethnic identity and of who we are, in many ways it, you know, stripped them of their individual identities and cultures, things that make, you know, white people unique, that make people unique, you know, whether they be Irish or Italian, how these, you know, these different groups in Birmingham were not always included under whiteness. How they were in many ways excluded, you know, to varying degrees, until it was convenient for them to be brought into under the banner of whiteness. And we see that today, as far as, like, how different minorities who may have come in and, you know, through their access to white privilege being kind of like ushered into whiteness or considered model minorities. But understanding, you know, and developing a class analysis and understanding how, you know, these wealth disparities and these class dynamics in many ways pit us against each other, and then studying, you know, Fred Hampton and, you know, the history of the Black Panther Party, how he wanted to build coalitions that were inclusive and that, you know, like the Rainbow Coalition in particular, that comes to mind. He wanted to build solidarity with white people because he understood that, you know, we weren't going to get free by, you know, just focus on our own individual issues. We're going to get free by working together, you know, and maybe and, you know, working through our differences and finding, you know, some form of reconciliation and accountability, because you can't have reconciliation without accountability. But us working together to dismantle these systems that, you know, oppress us in various ways. That means divesting from what whiteness is. That means divesting from, you know, this system that not only dehumanizes us, you know, as Black and brown people, but you know, but that dehumanizes you as well, because it forces you to have to reconcile with the sins of your ancestors and your own, you know, maybe, you know, privileges that, you know, you may have had access to that through no fault of your own, you know, that you know, benefit from, but, you know, may not have had the tools or the language to articulate or to, you know, in many ways, you know, give back or, you know, stand, you know, basically these intersections that may not allow you to, you know, be in community with people who don't look like you. And we're not going to get there by being colorblind. We're not going to get there by avoiding these conversations. We're going to get there by having these hard conversations. We're going to get there by coming to events like the Black Cherokee Project and understanding, you know, the history of lynching and white supremacy. We're going to get there by understanding how, you know, wealth disparities, how redlining, gentrification, how, you know, policing, how environmental racism has contributed to, you know, our collective disenfranchisement, and working together to rectify those issues.
Yeah, and I guess just simply put, I think this question. I got the mic. I got this one working.
Okay.
All right. So, you know, I think this is a really tricky question. I think it's, you know, it's tricky because when you want to tell, you don't want to alienate by telling them about the plight of the white Southerner. You don't want to alienate from drawing focus on the Black Southerner if you're trying to tell that story. I think that it's interconnected, though, in a lot of ways, and we have to think about that interconnectivity, specifically, especially when you talk about the plight of the white Southerner. The glue that kind of holds it together and connects it with the when you talk about the Black Southerner is, you know, white supremacy, because at the end of the day, the disenfranchised white Southerner still feels superior over their Black counterpart. Because of white supremacy. So you have to I do think you have to have that conversation. You have to, but you have to acknowledge the interconnectivity, because, you know, we're talking about our community. We're talking the bigger conversation is, you know, we're talking about the South, we're talking about Birmingham, we're talking about our community, which is dependent on each and every one of us. And everyone has a part that plays into the other part's story. And I think in order to have those conversations, they have to be done authentically, and they also have to be done tactfully, but at the same time unforgiving. And accountability. People have to. I think the bigger conversation to have that conversation is accountability, but also acknowledging not understanding. Because I think sometimes, at least just from me having conversations, maybe about, you know, talking about race or you know, acknowledging or talking about white privilege. Some people may not like to acknowledge it like other people, or either may it. So instead of looking at it like, okay, they'll never get it, I think it's more of taking a step back and realizing that you don't want someone to just agree with something out of fear of being criticized.
or just be like, yeah, okay, I get it. I understand white privilege because the media tells me about it, because you're telling me it exists. So I'm just going to agree with it. There has to be like a true understanding of that. The only way to get to that is through raw, honest conversations where we can pick apart those things. Because if we don't have those raw, honest conversations and someone just says what sounds right on the surface out of fear of how they're judged or looked at, all that's going to do is trickle down to the kids, trickle down to their families, because those real sentiments and feelings will just continue to get passed down. And so there has to be some kind of balance. And I think that's on our part. I mean, I often hear, I don't think that, like we as Black people have a responsibility to teach white people. I don't necessarily think that, but I do think we have a responsibility to our community. And if we, and as you mentioned when you talked about Sharif Simmons, the older you get, people, it's a lot more human than black and white. As cliche and as corny as it sounds, like, we're a human race, and everybody's so interconnected. So you can't, the issues of white supremacy affects everyone as a whole. Or when you see your Black neighbor or your white neighbor struggling, that's also inhibiting you in certain kind of ways. So to simply answer the question, I do think it is, you do have to talk about the plight of the white Southerner without it just has to be done. You have to tell the plight about the white Southerner and acknowledging the interconnectivity between the white Southerner and the Black Southerner, and how they're connected and how it feeds within each other, because it speaks to a broader problem that needs to be addressed.
So, we're gonna briefly go through this before we get to our last question. So, when I was rereading this chapter, I actually was going over folktales with some of my students this week for sociology, because we're talking about culture. And during this chapter, Perry talks about the romanticism, the romanticized Appalachia, and also the Appalachian era. And because we were already talking about folktales, my mind went to John Henry and Paul Bunyan, especially because their stories are so similar. Paul Bunyan was 6'3" with an axe. He had an ox or a best friend, which honestly, go off. Who would want an ox as a companion? I was born in the year of the ox, so it's great. And John Henry, he was also over 6'3". He was a Black man, and he was born with a 20-pound hammer in his hand. And both of their tales were created during Manifest Destiny, and they in a rising industrial society, and how they're working for low-class people. Paul Bunyan in particular working for his white low-class lumber town, and John Henry looking to move westward to what they call Canaan, and just trying to provide for the people that they cared for. And they became these great folk heroes. So whenever I think of the two narratives of race in the South, I started thinking about them. And it kind of reflects, both of them reflect Du Bois's double consciousness, which Perry does talk about within this chapter as well. Double consciousness, for those of you that don't know it, W.E.B. Du Bois, he's in Souls of Black Folks, one of his first texts, wrote that for the American Negro, we exist in a state of double consciousness, to be American and to be Negro. So I just wanted to quickly go through that. And for this, we kind of already answered this, but I do want to read that quote, because this chapter did start, it went from just the dichotomy of Black and white to the dichotomy of beautiful and ugly. And this is with the New Orleans chapter. So in this chapter, she opens with this fantasy of New Orleans that, in her words, people alternately call the most African and most European of American cities. She also goes on to explore the double meaning and historical significance of the fleur-de-lis, as well as brass pay. I'm probably pronouncing his name wrong. because I also don't know French. It is a stencil version, in terms of the fleur-de-lis, she said, it is a stencil version of a white and fragrant lily with baby soft petals. It is a signature feature of French heraldry. It makes the city pretty. And in the early 18th century, it had a particular purpose. If a runaway slave stayed away from his or her owner for over a month, their ears would be sliced off, and the fleur-de-lis permanently branded on one shoulder with a hot iron. Another infraction would require the runaway to be hamstrung, thus disabling them from ever running again, and the other shoulder to get the black lily burn as well. So, with the New Orleans chapter, she keeps going back to this idea of what's pretty about New Orleans and the reality of it for many of its Black citizens throughout history. And she ends the chapter talking about the Whitney Plantation, famed for its 1811 rebellion, as well as the current mission of historians and restorationists to preserve the history of the Whitney Plantation and recount the story through the eyes of the enslaved. She says at the end of the chapter, shadows and ghosts are essential to this story. Prose and images, if we are honest about what they do tell and all they cannot, are not verite, but a fleeting taste. Underneath them are layers that make you know that something that was here is gone. So we conjure them back up. That's not the thing itself, though. Rather, it's the definition of being haunted or history. So I was kind of confused on what Perry meant that is. I was like, is she saying that slavery is a burden? Is she saying that about our history? And I feel like that's your perspective on how you think of a haunting, on what you think of when you think of ghosts. Is it a very westernized idea of this big bad poltergeist that's here to make your house not livable, or is it more of a traditional African religion view of ghosts and spirits as ancestors that are here to guide us? But that's kind of where I want us to end off on. Are we haunted or are we empowered? And after you all answer that, I will open it up to the audience very briefly.
That last part is very telling. The definition of being haunted or history. Isn't there a word for that? Hauntology? Is that the word for it? Or am I using that incorrectly?
I'm not sure. How would we understand?
Yeah. Yeah, I think I think the term for that is like a hauntology, just like, you know, how the past haunts us in many ways. And I don't know, I come from a superstitious family, good old Black family that, we have stories like, hey, don't talk bad about, your folks and everything, or your dead folks, because they'll come see you in your sleep, that type of deal. We talk about like duppies and like, blue hags, like all that good stuff, right? In New Orleans in particular, being someone who has, for some reason has not been there before. I don't know why, but there are a lot of parallels between Birmingham and New Orleans in the sense of how, and I keep bringing this up, just like the dynamics of race, class, colorism, all those things work in tandem with each other. Remember you brought up in the past about how, in particular in New Orleans, there were a class of people there who they benefited somewhat from having proximity to whiteness. And many of these people were Black women or femmes who, and this, and you have to be very careful with this, because nowadays people love to use this and they benefit from scapegoating Black women in order to, from who have to navigate their own oppression, in their proximity to like whiteness or white manhood. It's such a complicated subject. Speaking from like experience, many of us, who are have a lighter complexion are a product of slavery, of rape, of a power dynamic that was not in the favor of our foremothers, right? And in particular, you asked the question, are we haunted or empowered by that? I think two truths can exist simultaneously. I'm gonna draw from personal experience here. So my grandmother always told me that her grandfather grew up with a white man's pay. And I was wondering to myself, especially as I got older, I'm like, what does that mean? Like, where emotion you at? We had a picture in his house, and he looked a little weird. He looked a little different. He didn't look quite like he looked like my grandmother and everything, but he didn't look, I mean, it was a black and white photo, mind you, but he was very light. He almost looked like a white man. And me and my mother, she had a class on, African studies class, and one of the aspects of the class was researching your family history. She looked back and she found out that this person was, he was what they called back then, a mulatto, meaning that he was biracial, multiracial. So what my grandma meant by him saying that he had a white man's pay is that he was, passing blanc. He was passing for white. He used that to work, in the factories here and be paid with the same privileges of whiteness that his white counterparts got. And I was wondering myself, how did he get away with that for so long? Because he went home to a house full of black children. Because he was raised with my grandma and her brothers and sisters, and all of them have various skin tones. And when I hear about the stories on, and I read different, read different books and watch different videos, like what's one that comes to mind? Eve's Bayou, and how these people, this community of black people, many of them are Creole descent, many of them having some degree of privilege because they were the descendants of a system and a hierarchy of extreme hierarchy of wealth and privilege that was based on their proximity to whiteness, based on their skin privilege, right? And because of that, they were able to, in many ways, glean and access wealth and privilege, but they, in many ways, alienated their darker skinned counterparts. And connecting that to Birmingham, we see that even today. You saw that even in my family, where although my grandfather and everything, he did. Well, my great great grandfather in this case, although he had access to this, he did use his privilege to funnel those resources into our particular family unit, or his to his descendants and children and grandchildren. There was still a colorless dynamic there where he privileged his children and grandchildren who were lighter skinned over the ones who happened to be darker skinned. And we see that even today in how, primarily with black women and families, and and to some degree, men, how in many ways they, darker skin is considered, because of how our weird gender dynamics work, it's considered more masculine, and lighter skin is considered fair and delicate and docile, and it's considered the feminine. And because of that, people in media primarily push lighter skinned people to the forefront, and give them certain privileges that are not extended to their darker skinned counterparts. And that, connecting back to slavery, is a product of these hierarchies that are meant to divide and keep us from standing in solidarity with one another. And although many of us have done the work of acknowledging that, working through what colorism is and what light skin privilege is, and working on trying to distill, if you're a light skinned person, working on trying to censor yourself, working on acknowledging it, working on understanding what colorism is, so that when you recognize it, you can empower and stand in solidarity with your brothers and sisters. Until we understand how that system was built, how that hierarchy, how that particular dynamic was developed, not only New Orleans but across the country, we will always continue to be haunted by that particular legacy. And although it's great that to see black people in media and see people survive and thrive, in many ways, you have to understand what aspects of your identity, what intersections of your identity may have allowed you to have access to those resources, those privileges in the first place. That's something you got to come to terms with. You know, one thing, you know, that, and I don't know if I've ever publicly said this, but I've told this people in my personal life, how many people have put me in places and it gave me opportunities because they saw me as being, you know, less volatile, as being more docile, or being more palatable than, you know, my darker skinned brothers and sisters. It's something that, you know, I try to recognize and try to come to terms with, and I always, you know, try to bring it to people's attention so that when they do that, you know, we're not excluding people who are more marginalized than ourselves, you know, and also acknowledge that the same way some of us are, you know, experience oppression, we also have the capacity to oppress others as well. But to bring up, to connect New Orleans and, you know, the European and the beauty of New Orleans in contrast to the hauntology of it. You know, this is a place, that's another place with a deep-rooted history, deep-rooted customs. Some of them have very much had access to many African traditions and customs that many of us, you know, have lost or may have not had access to or knowledge of, but they're still haunted by these class dynamics and haunted by these systems that, you know, contribute to their communities as well being segregated. Many of the people who suffered the most from Katrina, you know, they were people who existed in lower income communities, underserved communities, Black and brown communities, you know, housing communities, project houses. Those people, when that failure in infrastructure occurred, something that could have been prevented when that occurred, people who suffered the most were Black and brown people. So that's something for us to think about.
Just to kind of piggyback off of what you were saying, I think it's important to point out the abstraction of race. And you really got me to think about that when you were giving examples of your mulatto great grandfather. You know, because I think it's like races. I mean, when you really think about an example of, you know, someone who could pass as mulatto, and then even take that example in present day, it's a race. Race. Sorry, it was too close. All right. But race is determined. It's almost like it's determined from who perceives you. It's a social construct that, you know, if you appear on the surface, if you look white, you could be mixed, or, you know, culturally and everything identify as Black and be mixed, but on the outside appear mulatto, white. The world is going to perceive you that way. And then it kind of asks this question about, do we define, like, how should we define ourselves racially? Do we define it based on our blood, or do we define it on how we're perceived? Because at the end of the day, you know, someone who has darker skin, like if a cop pulls over someone who may be Black, would be very fair skinned and not appear as brown as me, then, you know, I may get discriminated against, prejudiced against, and treated in a different way than they may be treated, off of the outside perspective of how the race is seen, or, you know, how your racial identity is constructed. And so I think, like, you know, in kind of like looking at when we think about our history and thinking about, is it empowerment, or is it something that hunts us? That's also, you know, interesting to think about,
because in a lot of ways, yes, there are a lot of ramifications of slavery to this day that our society as a whole is still struggling to grapple with. You still have communities that are still suffering from economic instability that dates back to slavery, and I think that we on the other side of the coin, on the empowerment side, it's like there is a level of resilience that I think we have to acknowledge as Black people within our culture, and that also has had a lot of ramifications in very beautiful ways. Whether you look at music or whether you look at just even something like food, like soul food, like jazz, yeah. So then, like, going back into thinking about this perspective of race and who determines your racial identity and how it's constructed within our society, and then thinking about empowerment versus the hunting, whether it's empowerment or hunting, I think we can also tie that into that because it really doubles down to the perspective of it in some kind of ways in terms of but there's two perspectives. There's an external perspective and there's an internal perspective. And then I think the identity, the construction of that racial identity is dependent on a balance of those two, the external perspective and the internal perspective. And ultimately, I think it's really something that it's just interesting to kind of think about, like from my perspective, I think it's just interesting to think about how racial identities are constructed within our society, and also how how abstract it is, but the real world consequences of it. I think it's a much more complex issue that we just continue to have conversations like we're having tonight in order to really understand, like the realities of it. Because in one sense, when we think about the empowerment versus hunting aspect of thinking about slavery, I mean, often people, I think we throw around as a society this idea of a post-racial society, but I don't know if it's really valid if we really want that, because of the things like, as we mentioned, jazz, food, just the cultural side of things and the way that it makes up our identity, that gives everyone an individual sense of pride. And I think we also fool ourselves when we act like we've moved past racism, because even you take something like diversity in corporations or media, you may get a job like sometimes I ask myself, did I get my job at the Birmingham Museum of Art because they needed to diversify and bring in a Black face? Now, while that is positive, and there does need to be systems in place in order to have that, it still is using race as a way to identify and to calibrate the system in a way that I think we also have to acknowledge when we think about the future, do we like a post-racial society, or when we think about someone who's mulatto or may not appear to be Black and the privilege that they have, but then also acknowledging the identity that they probably struggle with. So, as you mentioned, I think it is empowerment or hunting. Like two truths can exist. Yeah.
So I would like to briefly open it up to the audience if any of you have any questions or comments. go to Hannah first.
Okay, I just wanted to touch on the idea of colorism, because I get that, but then also there was the one drop rule. And so, the point I wanted to make was that big light skin didn't say Philando Castile. So, that you can only take that so far, I think.
Couple things. First thing is I love jazz, and I was on my way over here. I was listening to Kim Scott's Block Party on jazzhall.com. Second thing is about the death of the Queen and their colonial past, and I believe during her reign that Jamaica gained their independence. Maybe they gained it before it, but basically it was not long after she took the throne. They're basically this worldwide slavery sort of thing, and they are making a good case for reparations. That they were colonized and the people were subjugated and all that, and that's kind of brings it into more of a recent perspective. And then the last thing is more of a geography situation I've learned since being in Birmingham, mainly by riding bicycles through some of these communities that are now in pretty rough shape. And I would disagree that I want to say at one time, Woodlawn, Eastlake, and Tarrant were prosperous communities. Now, with one thing I will give you is in Woodlawn, Gate City, which is now public housing, has been for a long time, was probably a pretty rough place. I've never seen any pictures of what Gate City looked like, but I'm imagining it was pretty rough. And during, the Great Society, and they built all the public housing, it was raised, and they put in the projects that are there today. Another thing, Tarrant being now the symbol in Birmingham is a failure of environmental justice and being a very polluted area. But you have to remember, at one time, Tarrant was a great place to live. A woman that I met while one of the many bicycle rides, actually lived there. She grew up there, and she said it was a great place to live. So, you have to understand that a lot has changed over periods of years. And I think a lot of that was because of white flight, really. And that's how, and redlining was certainly there. And I guess after World War II, the GI Bill and all that, and the federal national mortgage they basically wouldn't lend into black neighborhoods.
No matter what the outlook looks like, the existence of environmental racism proves the true nature of America. We are still putting waste facilities in poor communities. What other business is going to go there? They're justifying it as in a capitalistic manner, but it's for racism. Allowing communities in 2022 not to have clean water. These kind of things just prove, what we're really made of. If we can't fix problems that there's government money to fix, why are we not doing it? It's because of environmental racism. And, I'm gonna put your money where your mouth is, So if you're gonna prove you're not a racist, you prove you're not a racist, you do something about it, But that's just my 2 cents.
Both of y'all are absolutely correct. You're absolutely correct. And I'm glad, I really appreciate you articulating the fact that these places, they were not always, these, of course, to clarify, I was speaking specifically about the housing communities in particular. But yeah, Woodlawn was prosperous at one point, and with white flight, all of these systemic issues that push people out. And as black people moved in, they kind of like were left with the leftovers, it felt like. And then all these other issues that spread across the country, like crack epidemic, world drugs, those things, hit our communities. They put Woodlawn, Gate City, Kingston, Avondale, they put us in bad shape. There's a reason why many of the communities here in Birmingham are segregated by train tracks.
Oh, yeah. And, you know, and monetary goes into the whole Dollar Tree, not Dollar Tree, Dollar General and Family Dollar, the whole philosophy of, you know, yes, it's providing resources in a needy community. It also is a form of, you know, keeping people in food deserts and things like that. Yeah.
I think the interstate highway was probably the nail in the coffin for, you know, for a lot of these communities. And it's interesting, I saw I'm a civil engineer, and saw something in a trade publication that in Austin, the state is considering a rebuild of the interstate that cuts through the city, and there's a group of people who have got a grassroots movement to actually just go ahead and route it around the city and turn that, what is now the interstate, just like just a boulevard, a city street, and, you know, to try to rejoin the communities that were totally, you know, separated and cut in half. And, you know, it's all over Birmingham. I mean, you know, up there, I-59, not far from the intersection of 280, one of these neighborhoods which is just totally trashed. There's a pedestrian bridge over the interstate, you know, and when you get to the one end of it, there's nothing left, man. But at one time, there were homes there. People lived there. I mean, the streets are all there. You know, the blocks are all there. Everything's there, but there's nothing left, mainly because the interstate killed the whole neighborhood. Even though it had this pedestrian bridge going over the interstate.
Is there anybody else with a question or comment?
I also wanted to talk about the intersection between race and class that you all kind of alluded to, and how if you want to see gentrification in Birmingham, you only have to look at downtown. I mean, look at downtown, where Black people are being priced out completely. You know, so we don't have to look far and wide. It's right there in the hub of the city.
I just want to say, I'm sending around a list if you want to add your email so that you can learn more about the rest of the series. And we do have food if anybody wants to. Nobody's touched the food, so grab something before we close.
So I did want to go ahead and close this out. Our next event, we will be talking about the theme of race and class in the book a little bit more in depth with 4 other chapters. 3? I think I chose 3. 3 other chapters, and that will be at Thank You Books over in Crestwood, right next to the subway and that shopping center. And that will be at 5 p.m. on Friday, October 7th. That will be a Socratic circle, so it'll be a discussion with you all having it amongst yourselves. I'll be there to provide the questions, and you will have access to those beforehand so you can review the text. But it's really just a conversation with the Birmingham community for the most part, especially because of the topic. I felt that was one that's necessary, not to have somebody having a conversation in front of you, but you all having a conversation amongst yourselves. Great. And as Ms. Shannon said, food